we're talking about what we're now seeing all across the country, and that is workers who understand when you look at companies with record profits and how they're not necessarily sharing those with workers. You got folks who are demanding better wages, better conditions, and the way to do that is through collective bargaining. And so here in Atlanta, what you have going on is the effort when it comes to unionizing Delta ramp workers. Now, many of us fly, and we just walk right past folks all the time. When you're getting on and off the plane, the folks who are sitting here taking the bags off when it comes to also making sure that we're able to push back on time. So many people just ignore those workers. But the reality is we saw during COVID what happens when we talk about those frontline critical workers. Without those individuals, a lot of us are screwed. But do we think about working conditions? Do we thinking about them time off? Do we think about also wages? And so that's what this effort is about. And so joining me right now to get this conversation started is the General Vice President for the IAMAW Air Transport, Richie Johnson. Richie, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Roland. Thanks.
All right, so let's get this set off. First of all, again, for the folk watching who ain't got no clue what ramp workers do.
All right, well, your ramp workers are the folks that get your bags on the plane, make sure that they're there when you land in your destination. You know, they do a very physical job, but it's also a very dangerous job. You know, a lot of people don't take into consideration just what they go through on a daily basis. You know, you're around jet engines. There's a lot of heavy equipment out there.
A little noisy.
It's just a little bit noisy. And let's not forget the weather. You know, this time of year, it's extremely hot. In the winter, it's very cold in a lot of the destinations. So these folks, you know, they do a critical job. And it's not just about picking up a bag and throwing it on a plane. I mean, they're making sure that your stuff is taken care of.
Folks don't realize in Texas and Florida, where you had Republican governors who actually had laws passed where they said cities could not mandate water breaks for folks who work outdoors. And a lot of people just act like that was no big deal. But when you're having to work outdoors in the heat, in the cold, you're thinking about stuff like that.
Of course. And look, you know, in the case of the other carriers that are all unionized, they have an advocate on their side. They have somebody making sure that those things are being taken care of. And, you know, you've got a lot of Delta workers here, and they'll tell you when you have an opportunity to talk to them that that's not what's happening out there on their properties. Because there's just nobody holding Delta Airlines accountable.
So of the other carriers, how many of them, their ramp workers are unionized?
Nearly all of them. I would say it's at the 95%.
So United,
American, Southwest, Alaska, Hawaiian, I mean, and we represent all of them. Or most of them.
How long has this fight with Delta been going on?
Oh, it's been going on for decades and decades, but it really reached a pinnacle, you know, when there was the merger between Northwest and Delta Airlines. At that time, the Delta folks were represented by the Machinists Union, my union, and there was an election. And so, you know, we lost that election by a very narrow margin. I think it was about 300 votes. When you're talking about 15,000 people. So 150 people changed their vote, and we're not even having this discussion today. But so that battle's been going on full tilt since then. There's been, it's interesting actually because, you know, there's this misconception out there that unions are out there, you know, hunting after people to organize. The reality is we were invited to this party.
So explain that process for the person at home who doesn't quite understand how these things work. Because we hear about elections, we hear about companies saying, oh, we don't like folks coming in. Walk through that process. What does that mean you were invited in?
So what that means is that the employees at any carrier that are non-union, or any company for that matter, even outside of the airline industry, you know, they have to have a showing of interest. They have to come to a union and say, we want to get organized. We want a union on our property.
That's employee-driven.
100% employee-driven, because, quite frankly, we'll never win an election if it's just because we want it. The employees have to want that. They have to advocate for themselves. They have to fight for themselves. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, when they do become organized or unionized, they're the union. They're the ones negotiating their contracts. Of course, we're helping, we're advocating, we're giving them tools, we're teaching, we're giving them all the things they need to be successful, including our assistance. But at the end of the day, it's their union. They own it.
So what then happens is they invite you in, and then what's the next step?
So the next step would be to, you know, to get an idea of what size unit we're talking about, how many people have shown interest to get involved, How do we build inside committees? And come up with a plan of action, both an internal and external plan for how we can have a successful drive. But before we do any of that, we talk to the employees. We have informational meetings. We get feedback from those employee groups to see just how serious they are and if it's something that they think that they can fulfill.
And so these are rent workers across the country. And so when we're talking about this election, how is that scheduled? How does that process work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough process because we fall under the Railway Labor Act, and that's no easy task. There has to be a showing of interest. 50% plus one of the membership has to sign a card saying that they want an election. And when you're talking about a Delta Airlines, you're talking about a very significant number.
So basically, you got to have like a pre-election before the election.
That's correct.
So 50 plus 1% has to say, we want an election.
We want an election. Now, we present those cards to the National Mediation Board, who governs the Railway Labor Act. They go through that. If there's enough cards, they'll call for an election. And then, once the election happens, I will say that the Railway Labor Act has changed a little bit over the years. In fact, under Barack Obama, it changed pretty significantly. It used to be you didn't necessarily have to have 50% plus one card signed. You could have less than that. You could have a significant showing of interest, and the board could decide to have an election. But in the election, you had to have 50% plus one in order to get certified. That means anybody that didn't vote was an automatic no vote. Now, under Barack Obama, that changed. He changed that.
Wow, so anybody who didn't vote was automatic no vote?
It was an automatic no vote. You had to have 50% plus one of the total group vote in favor of the union. Now, there's no democratic process in this whole country that is that difficult. That you wouldn't have there'd be no elections. No one would ever get elected if 50% plus one had to vote for a single candidate.
That sounds like a good idea in some places.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't argue that with you.
Go ahead.
You know, I could think of a couple. But under Obama, that changed. And so the way it changed was you had to have a 50% plus one showing of interest of signing of cards. But when the election happened, it was a majority. And that was significant. Makes it getting to an election more difficult.